Okay, so as I already said, good afternoon and thank you for being here. Now, have you ever wondered which mechanisms and which processes underlie, in fact, one of the most fundamental properties of your mental grammar, namely productivity? Well, today I'm going to talk about productivity as part of the implicit linguistic knowledge of speakers, and also as a property, an inherent property of constructions. Because indeed, each construction that makes up our grammar has its own domain of application and its own potential to incorporate new lexical words or new members. So for instance, if we have a look at the minimizing construction, that is a quite productive construction in English, it consists of, besides the negator, a verb slot and also an NP slot that reinforces the negation, as in he doesn't understand a word, he doesn't know a thing, a iota, etc. So as you can see here, different lexemes can fill both the verb and the NP slot. Now, the transitive construction that, of course, we all know has a very wide range of applications. So new verbs such as Googling or binge watching can also appear in that kind of construction, as opposed to, for instance, a construction such as me thinks. This is a weird construction where think would probably the only verb that is possible in this construction. So there is a kind of decline of productivity of constructions in the network, which in the literature has led to a broad range of quantitative approaches, as we will see during this presentation. Now, against this background, today I would like to focus on the particular mechanism of metaphors that act as engines for productivity. And more particularly, I will show how these metaphors contribute to the well-known, it has already been described before, development of full lexical verbs into auxiliary verbs. And I will focus on a highly interesting, I think at least, but understudied construction in Spanish. So this case study is part of a larger project called Language Productivity at Work, from Ghent University, which examines how and why some syntactic patterns become in the language more productive and others do not. And it's a project that combines synchronic, diachronic, sociolinguistic, psychological, and psycholinguistic research. So the case study that I will be presenting today has been developed in close collaboration with my PhD student Sven van Hulle, who was in fact responsible for the data collection. Okay, so now back to metaphors. As you probably also know, ever since the time of Aristotle, metaphors have indeed been at the center of scholarly research. If we just take a look at this graph, which is a very simple graph taken from Scopus and the Scopus database, it shows that since the second part of the 20th century, the number of papers and books dedicated to the topic has only been increasing. And indeed, metaphors have been studied as powerful rhetorical devices of language in literature, in art, music, politics, law, philosophy, and even psychology. Now, given the inseparable link between metaphor and speech, also, in fact, the number of linguistic studies can no longer be kept up. And a crucial theory also for my talk today is the conceptual metaphor theory that, as you probably also know, started with George Lakoff and Mark Johnson and the publication of their book, Metaphors We Live By. And since the publication of this book, a growing body of cognitive research, including cognitive linguistics, discovered that metaphor is a very important conceptual tool for structuring and even creating everyday thought. Now, the standard definition of conceptual metaphor is this one. So a conceptual metaphor is understanding one domain of experience, so that is typically abstract, in terms of another one that is typically concrete. So what you get is that there are source domains or source domain frames, that are mapped onto target domain frames, and they give rise to metaphorical reasoning. So I guess you're all familiar with, for instance, the love is a journey metaphor. So in fact, they can be considered as crucial strategies also for language productivity, because existing lexical items or linguistic expressions, they are then attracted to other existing schemas to form new metaphorical expressions. So this talk is concerned with the importance of metaphors to explain the high productivity of a particular construction in Spanish, namely the aspectual inchoative construction, which expresses, as you can see here, the start of an event. In fact, it's a construction that hasn't received a lot of attention in the literature. From a formal perspective, we could say that it's composed out of 4 slots. So we have the subject or NP1 slot, an auxiliary, then a preposition a in contemporary Spanish, and an infinitive. And it conveys the meaning of an agent or a cause, start the event expressed by the infinitive. As in the Spanish sentence, Juan empieza a trabajar, John starts to work. Now, whereas the inchoative meaning is already contained in the verb empezar, to start itself, this is certainly not the case in the also highly frequent variants, such as Juan rompe a llorar, so literally meaning John breaks to cry, John starts to cry, or Juan se echa a reír, John throws himself to laugh, or even Juan salta a ayudar, John jumps to help, so he starts to help. And so the semantic paths that lead from these domains of concrete physical activity to the inchoative aspect have, to my knowledge at least, not yet been explored in detail. Now, for practical reasons, today I will only be able to focus on the destruction verbs such as romper, to break, as productive sources for the inchoative periphrasis. So, hence the specific goals of my talk today. So first of all, I will establish the list of auxiliary or semi-auxiliary verbs that appear in the Spanish inchoative construction, and so demonstrate the high degree of productivity. And then second, I will investigate how and when the inchoatives, with the particular case of destruction verbs, have developed as micro-constructions of a more general schema. Okay, now before moving to the concrete analysis, some words on the central topic of this conference day, which is, as we heard in the previous talk, the link between linguistic research and teaching. Now, since unfortunately I'm not an expert in didactics research, I will not be able to comment on this during my talk, but I invite the experts in the audience to reflect on, for instance, how notions such as productivity and notions such as conceptual metaphors can constitute an added value for the development of didactic materials and also models. And at a more specific level, I think that a second challenge consists in the particular teaching of verbal periphrasis, which is, for instance, very productive in Spanish and I guess also in Portuguese, more than in other languages. So these are some topics that we could address during the debate afterwards if you want. Okay, so let's move on to the first part and first take a closer look at the general productivity of the inchoative construction. Now, as a starting point, we created a list of 10 established semi-auxiliaries, so auxiliaries that are frequently cited in the literature, such as arrancar, such as romper, comenzar, empezar, etc. Now, what we did was we constituted an exhaustive synonym check with the help of some dictionaries. And so for all these verbs, we listed all possible synonyms, which resulted in a list of over more than 1,000 potential verbs. And then we simply checked in Sketch Engine whether there are some patterns, some tokens from the inchoative construction. Now, as a result, we found 50 new verbs that were not mentioned in the literature. So 15 verbs that are also able to appear in this kind of construction, which then led us to the assumption that there are at least in Spanish 25 ways to express the start of an event. So with all the verbs that you can see here on the screen. Now, to put more order, and by taking into account the original lexical meaning of these verbs, in fact, we could conclude that in Spanish, or the construction at least, recruits its auxiliaries or semi-auxiliaries from at least 6 semantic fields. So there are the superlexical verbs with empezar, comenzar, iniciar, principiar. Also, interestingly, the put verbs are attracted to the schema with poner, to put, meter, to put. But we also have throw verbs such as arrojar, echar, lanzar, tirar, so verbs that express some launching. We have movement verbs such as embarcar or even zambullir, to dive. Verbs that we call verbs of manual manipulation such as agarrar, and then the verbs of destruction that will be important for today. So I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but here are some examples for the different lexical fields. So for instance, here in 2, cuando se jubiló, se metió a trabajar como conductor. When he retired, literally, he put himself to work as conductor, so he started to work as. Or in 5, la pelirrosa soltó a llorar en los brazos. The red-haired girl, literally, she released herself to cry. She started to cry. Now, as I said, today we will dive into the question of how the domain of destruction with verbs such as arrancar, to tear off, estallar, explotar, to explode, prorrumpir, to break, to burst, reventar, to shatter, and romper, of course, how they were attracted to the schema. Now, as you have probably already noticed, the approach underlying this study is the constructional one. So we believe that it's highly suited to study this topic. And you know also that one of the basic premises of construction grammar is that conventional expressions that are presented frequently enough are recognized by speakers as abstract patterns or cognitive schemas. So from the highest level of abstraction to the most concrete level, these are then organized in sub-schemas, microconstructions, allostructions, and also constructs. Now, given the above definition, I then would suppose that speakers have, like in Spanish at least, a mental inchoative schema in mind. And at a lower level, there would then be several sub-schemas created through metaphor, one with destruction verbs, with throw verbs, put verbs, etc. Now, what will also be important for today is the idea that the constructional approach has also been put forward as a highly adequate model to account for language change. So we are all familiar with the model of grammatical constructionalization. And so it focuses on how configurations of sets of expressions changes. So this means that when you have linguistic change, it does not only apply to a concrete individual linguistic item, but involves network family members. So this has consequences for the internal and external configuration of a network. So for instance, new patterns can arise, whereas old ones disappear. Some patterns become more productive, invade the domain of others. And as to the configuration, of a network then, it can remain stable, it can grow, it can shrink. And so we will see that all these tendencies, they also apply to the diachronic evolution of the destruction sub-schema. Now, in sum, why, how, and when were the destruction verbs attracted to the inchoative schema? So that's the question, one of the questions for today. And so through which conceptual metaphor? And we will see that also here analogical matching that was previously identified as an important mechanism of change in the constructionalization model. It also plays an important part in the extending productivity of the encodative. Okay, so let's now move on to the concrete case study. So this is the structure. So first I will start by disentangling the conceptual metaphor, adopting also a cross-linguistic perspective. In the second part, we will then turn to a diachronic analysis in order to observe the rise and development of a particular subschema with destruction verbs. Then we will look into the behavior of two competing microconstructions with romper and arrancar in terms of their general and also semantic productivity in point 3. And then finally, in the last part, we will consider the recent incorporation into the schema of other microconstructions through the process of semantic analogy and analogical matching. Okay, so first of all, the metaphor. So if you think about it, the semantic field of destruction in general, so which refers to reduction to pieces or the reduction to ashes of something material causing serious damage. So this is definition that you would find in the dictionary. So this semantic field constitutes in several languages a productive source to express the beginning of an event. So in English, for instance, we find the following expressions. So the day breaks, all hell breaks loose, to break into a gallop, break out in tears, to burst into tears, or for instance, at the crack of dawn. In French, we find éclater de rire, éclater en applaudissement, éclater en sanglots. And also in Portuguese, we have rebentar de riso, romper en choro, ao romper do dia, etc. And also in Spanish, of course, the list is quite long, with romper en risas, arrancar en un baile, or for instance here, reventar en un ataque de histeria. Now, this privileged link between the semantics of undo and the aspectual inchoative value seems to have gone unnoticed, at least as far as I know, in the linguistic literature, which is quite surprising in the light, of course, of these cross-linguistic data, and also because of the fact that it does refer to a striking change of state. Now, here you have some more examples with the destruction verbs that we are interested in today. Romper a llorar, prorrumpir a llorar, estalló a llorar, which would mean burst into tears, explotar a reír, burst out laughing, or here, arrancar a volar, literally to break out, to fly, start to fly. Now, the question is then, how the semantic basis common to all these verbs explains their incorporation into the inchoative schema. Now, according to the basic definition, romper, to break, means so to cause a thing to cease to be whole or complete, or to lose continuity. Now, in its most concrete use, break, romper, is combined with mostly hard physical objects. So, for instance, you break a window, romper la ventana. In Spanish, romper is also used with less consistent, but still physical objects. So you would say in Spanish, romper la hoja, so to tear a sheet, to tear apart a sheet. Now, interestingly, break also often selects abstract themes that express a kind of event. So this usage is more to be defined as then to interrupt the continuity of something non-material. For instance, in romper el silencio, so to break the silence. There are, of course, other examples. So you have states, you have processes, you have developments that are affected by breaking their temporal extension. For instance, also romper la tensión, to break the tension. Now, in these contexts, instead of referring to the disintegration of a concrete object, what you have is that the endurance of the event is broken. And the change of state results then in the fact that there is, for instance, no more union, there is no more tension, there is no more silence. Now, this semantic extension helps us to better understand the semantic extension of the verbs towards the inchoative value. Because, in fact, paradoxically, I think, so to break can refer both to the process of stopping an event or state, but also at the same time to the process of starting another one. And so the semantics that underlies these two values is then that breaking the durability of an event is stopping the inertia of that event in order to start a new one. So from this perspective, the semantic complexity of a sentence like Juan rompe a llorar, so John breaks to cry, starts to cry, can be understood as John, he undoes the temporal integrity of the state of inertia in which he finds himself in order to cry. So the subject is undoing the continuity of the state just before the action of crying begins. So in short, the metaphorical extension of break verbs underlying the integration into the inchoative construction is as follows. So you change or you destroy the integrity of a concrete object is like changing or destroying the integrity of an abstract object. The integrity of a state or process is like breaking the inertia of that state or process in order to start a new one. So this would lead to the following conceptual metaphor that connects the literal meaning to the aspectual, abstract meaning, namely undoing the integrity of a material object is like disintegrating the continuity of a state of inertia and starting a new eventuality. Okay. So in order to better understand how the semantic field of verbs of destructions has then developed as a productive subschema in Spanish, I think it's interesting to turn to a diachronic and a synchronic empirical study, so to have a closer look at the data. The diachronic database was compiled from the Corpus Diacrónico del Español, CORDE, and also the corpus of the Diccionario Histórico de la Lengua Española. For the 21st century, the data come from the S101018 corpus, which, as you know, can be accessed through the Sketch Engine platform. So we extracted from these corpora all the uses of the verbs under destruction as an inchoative, which resulted in a database of over 1,700 tokens. Now, the historical overview shows that the frequency of the data obtained per century, so with the first occurrence in the 17th century in Spanish, but also for the individual verbs, it varies to a large extent. So here in the 17th century, for instance, you see that almost no inchoative uses are observed, except for some cases with arrancarse and just one case with prorrumpir. The productivity increases in the 19th century, but this by the integration of romper into the schema. And it's quite striking that when it appears in the corpus, it's immediately with a very high frequency of use. So we have no explanation for this. Then in the 20th century, you see that romper, to break, is still the most dominant one. But there are more cases observed with arrancar, and you see that other verbs are attracted to the schema, although with a very low frequency. But we have, for instance, estallar, we also have reventar. And then finally, in the 21st century, you see that romper is still the most dominant one, but a last verb was also observed, namely explotar, is also incorporated into the inchoative schema. So in conclusion, you could say that since the 19th century, romper has developed as the dominant member, which is probably to be explained by its semantic neutral profile, which allowed then to apply the conceptual metaphor. And then at a later stage, probably speakers have then generalized a productive constructional subschema, which allowed them to incorporate gradually more verbs of destruction. So you have a kind of analogical extension that started with romper, And this was only possible because speakers had internalized into the auxiliary position the semantics of integration, so the conceptual metaphor as a whole, rather than just one particular lexeme, which would be romper. Okay, so as you can see here in the quantitative data, also arrancar occupies a central position quite early already in the development of the subschema. So this is why I think in the next phase that it's interesting to compare the functional profile of the dominant and competing microconstructions to see whether they are near synonyms or not. And so we will do this by comparing their behavior with respect to the productivity measures. So I don't know how much you are familiar with productivity measures, but I will just mention them very quickly. So of course, there is the notion of token frequency that refers in general to just the number of occurrences of a construction in a corpus. Also very interesting is the notion or the value of type frequency, which refers to the number of different words. So in our case, that will be the number of different infinitives it combines with, that is documented with a certain construction. And the idea is that the higher the type frequency, this would indicate a higher productivity. Hapax frequency refers to the number of types which occur only once in a corpus. And also here, the idea is that if you have more hapax legomena, the construction is more likely to incorporate new verbs in the future and is thus more productive. So we will more particularly have a look at the measures of type token ratio and hapax token ratio. Okay. Here we have two graphs, and the data presented in these graphs, so for type token ratio of arrancar, which is the blue line from the 17th century until the 21st century, and data for romper with the orange line, so we have type token ratio and hapax token ratio. And you see that in general, arrancar seems to be more productive than the variant with romper, although romper has a higher token frequency. So you see here, as to type token ratio, that throughout its development, arrancar combines with more different infinitives than the incoative with romper. As to hapax token ratio, you see that, well, it leads to the same conclusion. So you see that in all centuries, arrancar is combined with more new and unique infinitives than romper, whose semantic attraction is much more restricted. And also, it's interesting to see that in the 21st century, the productivity of both verbs seems to go down. So this could be linked to the development of other competing auxiliary members. Now, as I already mentioned, an important connection also needs to be made between productivity and semantics. So it's interesting to have a look at notions such as semantic coherence and semantic density. So the idea is here that the higher the semantic spread of a construction, the higher its productivity, and the lower the spread, the lower its productivity. So that's why in the next step, we investigate whether the constructions with arrancarse and romper, whether they pertain to specific lexical fields in terms of the infinitives they select. And the idea is the more different semantic classes that are attested, the more semantically productive the macro construction is. So therefore, we have a look at the adese, so the number of different types of infinitives according to the adese classification that makes a distinction between mental verbs, material verbs, verbal or communication verbs mostly, relational verbs, modulation, and existential verbs. Okay, so I won't go into detail here because we are mostly interested in the evolution and the comparison. So this graph then, again, shows the frequency of the different semantic classes observed for each verb, arrancarse in blue, romper in orange, and also for each century. And as you already know, we observe an increasing semantic productivity of the incoative in general. The data also confirm the higher degree of arrancarse compared to romper, because you see, for instance, that in the 21st century, arrancar opens up to all the semantic classes, whereas romper becomes more lexicalized, so more specialized, with only 3 different classes, despite, again, its overall increasing frequency. So the following table shows in more detail the distribution of these lexical classes. So I know it's a bit complex, a lot of numbers, a lot of percentages, but let me just walk you through the data. So we will start with romper, with first occurrence in the 19th century. And you see that romper mostly combines with material verbs in over 70% of the cases. And also quite frequent are the verbal verbs. Llorar, to cry, is by far the most frequent infinitive. The same tendency is in fact observed in the 20th century. But here you see that some minor categories, such as mental verbs, relational verbs, and modulation verbs are added. These minor categories, they almost disappear from the 21st century data, and you see that the class of material verbs becomes more dominant, and that even the category of verbal verbs shrinks. So this is mostly due to the high frequency of romper a llorar and also romper a hervir. So to start to cry, to start to boil. So in fact, you could say that it shows that romper tends to appear in lexicalized structures. Arrancarse is documented from the 17th century with the infinitives correr and huir, which are verbs of movement. So it really, from the beginning, preferred those verbs of movement. The trend is confirmed too in later centuries, which explains the high amount of material verbs also with arrancar. Now, from the 19th century, it opens up to include more verbs, mostly verbal verbs. And so you see that, also in the 21st century, as you already know, all 6 lexical classes are there. So arrancar seems to become like a super lexical inchoative verb that imposes fewer restrictions on its collocations. Now, as a last step in the description of semantic productivity, we will then study the evolution of the density, the semantic density or the coverage or the semantic variability of the fillers in semantic space. So this is based on a measure that takes into account the average distance between pairs of fillers. And in fact, it allows us to check whether a construction is developing in a particular semantic region or whether it has different islands of productivity. Now, in the specific case of romper and arrancar, it will allow us to examine whether they have a complementary or a similar profile. Now, it's a quite complex method. The measures are obtained by creating a vector space model based on a kind of dissimilarity matrix that takes into account semantic distances between the fillers, so between the infinitives. And then the coordinates of the different infinitives or fillers are calculated by using a multidimensional scaling method, which perhaps you discussed yesterday. And then you have different coordinates that are visualized in a semantic map, as on this slide. So here you see a lot of dots. All these dots represent coordinates of fillers of the constructions in a semantic space. So the blue dots are the dots with arrancar. The red ones are the fillers of romper, and then the green dots, as you can see here, these are shared infinitives. And then from the bottom until the top, we have the semantic space as it is in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. So here in 19th century, you see that in general, you have a low semantic productivity of arrancar. as it combines with very few different infinitives. Romper was more productive, but you see that the infinitives are clustered in a particular area of the semantic space, whereas already with arrancar, the infinitives are more dispersed. In the 20th century, the frequency of the two microconstructions increases. You see that there are more dots, and this is especially the case for romper, while arrancar remains at the same level and most of its fillers are shared with romper. Now, finally, in the last graph, you see that this is the most different one. And so the graph situation in the 21st century, mostly arrancar has made a very big leap and is not only combined with more different infinitives, it also occupies a broader, larger semantic space, whereas romper, on the other hand, operates in a very dense area with, of course, some exceptions. So the semantic maps also confirm that romper becomes more lexicalized, whereas arrancar is more semantically open. Okay, and then as a final step, very quickly, I think it's just interesting to show some examples that show how the other members of the field of destruction through the conceptual metaphor were incorporated into the schema through semantic analogy. So we have a very low frequency of these cases, so it's not based on quantitative measures, but it's more like a qualitative discussion of some examples. So, for instance, prorrumpir, meaning to burst, it appears in the 17th century, mostly with verbs that refer to the abrupt beginning of an act of saying. And also in later centuries, it exclusively selects verb of communication. So it seems that prorrumpir is restricted to infinitives that have some sema of noise, some semantics of noise. And in fact, this repeats its original lexical meaning. Estallar, to explode, as you see here. Estalla a llorar, estallo a reírme, appears later in the schema, as we already know, so the first half of the 20th century, but it's mostly also lexicalized with llorar and with reír, so not very productive. Similarly, reventar, also meaning to burst, is mostly...
Renata?
Yeah?
You have more 5 minutes, okay?
Yeah, I'm almost finished.
Thank you.
Reventar is also combined most frequently with llorar and with hablar, and you see that here, reventó a hablar, porque su interior era una olla a presión. It refers to some internal pressure. And well, if I would have more time, we could also do the semantic analysis, and we would see that this is also typical for the verb, also beyond the inchoative construction. And then finally, explotar is an inchoative auxiliary that appears very late, so in the 21st century. It selects also llorar and reír, but it seems to open up to other infinitives as well, as in explota a aplaudir, to explode, to burst into an applause. So to conclude, so we could say that these minority verbs were incorporated into the field primarily by analogy with the verb of romper. And the idea is that, well, since romper a llorar, for instance, and romper a hervir and a reír were then that frequently used in discourse, for speakers, it became not expressive enough. And so that's why they resorted to quasi-synonyms to express the aspect of abruptness of the onset of the action. Okay, so a very quick conclusion. So I hope to have shown how the conceptual metaphor of destroying a material object is like disintegrating an event to start a new one, how this metaphor has been an important mechanism of productivity of this concrete construction. The presentation also showed the added value of a constructional approach and also how competing microconstructions develop and interact. So in future research, it will be interesting to look into the conceptual metaphors lying at the basis of other sub-schemas. So for instance, the throw verbs, also the movement verbs, or even the verbs of manual manipulation. So Juan soltó a reír, literally meaning he released himself to laugh. Okay, so that was it. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, of course, I will be very happy to answer them.